The autumn rain drummed steadily against the glass facade of Meridian Shopping Center in downtown Portland, Oregon. Inside, the polished marble floors reflected the warm glow of store lights as shoppers hurried between boutiques and cafes, their umbrellas dripping in the entryway. The familiar sounds of conversations, footsteps, and distant music from the food court created the typical afternoon symphony of American retail life. Sarah Chen navigating through the crowd with practiced confidence, her white cane tapping rhythmically against the floor. At 23, she had learned to read the world through sound and touch, the whisper of fabric as people passed, the subtle change in acoustics that told her when she approached a storefront, the warmth radiating from the coffee shop that meant she was near her destination. She wore a simple navy pea coat over dark jeans, her long black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Despite her blindness since birth, Sarah moved with purpose and grace, though today she seemed slightly hesitant, pausing occasionally to listen more carefully to her surroundings. "Excuse me," she said politely to someone nearby, her voice carrying a slight West Coast accent mixed with traces of her family's Chinese heritage. "Could you help me find the management office? I have an appointment." The teenager she'd addressed barely glanced up from his phone. "I dunno, lady. Try the directory or something." He walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone near what she could tell was a busy intersection of the mall's corridors. From across the walkway, two security guards watched the scene unfold. Marcus Thompson, a heavy-set man in his 40s with graying temples, nudged his younger colleague, Jake Rivera, a lanky 26-year-old with ambitious eyes and an eagerness to prove himself. "Look at that," Marcus muttered, adjusting his radio on his belt. "Another one of those scammers. They come in here pretending to be disabled, looking for sympathy handouts or planning to slip something into their bag when no one's watching." Jake frowned, studying Sarah's movements. "You sure? She looks legitimate to me. That cane technique seems pretty real. Trust me, kid. I've been doing this for 15 years. Half these people are faking it." Marcus's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd grown cynical about human nature. "Watch how she's moving around too much, trying to draw attention. Real blind people don't act like that." Sarah, unaware of the scrutiny, approached what sounded like an information desk. "Hello. Is anyone there? I'm looking for the management office. I have a 3 o'clock appointment with Mr. Harrison." The young woman at the desk looked up from painting her nails, annoyed at the interruption. "Management's on the 3rd floor. Take the elevator." She didn't bother to point or offer additional help. "Which direction is the elevator?" Sarah asked patiently. "I don't know, figure it out," came the dismissive reply. Sarah took a deep breath, her shoulders tensing slightly. She'd encountered this attitude before, the assumption that asking for basic directions was somehow unreasonable. She began moving more carefully, using her cane to navigate toward what she hoped was the elevator bank, her confidence visibly shaken by the hostile reception. Marcus saw his opportunity. "Come on," he told Jake, straightening his uniform shirt. "Time to clear out the riffraff before the real customers complain." They approached Sarah just as she reached the elevator area, her cane detecting the change in flooring texture that indicated she was close to her destination. The mechanical whir of the elevator arriving gave her a moment of relief. "Excuse me, miss," Marcus said, his voice taking on an official tone that echoed slightly in the open space. "I'm going to need you to move along." Sarah turned toward the voice, confusion evident on her face. "I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get to the management office. I have an appointment." "Sure you do," Marcus replied skeptically. "Look, we've had problems with people like you coming in here, causing disruptions, bothering paying customers. This is a private establishment, and we have the right to ask you to leave." "People like me?" Sarah's voice carried a note of disbelief. The elevator doors opened behind her, and she could hear other shoppers getting on, their conversations fading as the doors closed again. Jake shifted uncomfortably. Something about the woman's genuine confusion was bothering him. "Marcus, maybe we should." "She's probably casing the jewelry store," Marcus interrupted, his voice growing louder and attracting attention from nearby shoppers. "They send in people who look innocent, get everyone's sympathy, then signal their partners about security gaps." Sarah's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Around them, she could hear conversations stopping, feel the weight of stares even though she couldn't see them. The familiar sounds of the mall seemed to fade as her situation became the center of unwanted attention. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice steady despite her rising distress. "I'm here for a legitimate business meeting. If you could just call the management office." "The only call I'm making is to have you escorted out," Marcus cut her off. "Jake, radio for backup. We're removing a trespasser." "This is ridiculous," Sarah said, her professional composure beginning to crack. "I have every right to be here. I'm not bothering anyone." "You're bothering me," Marcus replied curtly. "And you're making our legitimate customers uncomfortable with your aggressive panhandling behavior." "Panhandling?" Sarah's voice rose in indignation. "I haven't asked anyone for money. I'm trying to get to a business meeting." A small crowd had begun to gather, some filming with their phones, others whispering among themselves. The typical afternoon energy of the mall had shifted to focus on the confrontation unfolding near the elevators. Jake looked around nervously at the growing attention. "Marcus, this is getting out of hand. Maybe we should verify her story first." "Don't go soft on me now, Rivera," Marcus snapped. "This is exactly the kind of situation that tests whether you've got what it takes for this job." Sarah could hear the murmurs around her, catch fragments of comments. Some seemed sympathetic, others dismissive. The vulnerability of being unable to see the faces of those judging her situation made everything worse. "Please," she said, reaching into her purse. "I have identification, I can show you." "Keep your hands where I can see them," Marcus barked, misinterpreting her movement as potentially threatening. "Jake, call for backup now." The command echoed through the corridor, causing more shoppers to stop and stare. Sarah froze, her hand still in her purse, the absurdity and humiliation of the situation overwhelming her. This was supposed to be one of the most important days of her life, and instead she was being treated like a criminal in front of dozens of strangers. The elevator arrived again, its doors opening to reveal more confused shoppers who quickly realized they were witnessing some kind of confrontation. The mechanical voice announced, "Going up," but nobody moved to board. As Jake reluctantly reached for his radio, his finger hesitating over the call button, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to argue or trying to prove her legitimacy, she simply stood there, dignified in her stillness, letting the weight of the injustice speak for itself. The rain continued to fall outside, drumming against the windows like an angry heartbeat, as if the weather itself was responding to the tension building inside Meridian Shopping Center. What none of them knew was that, in just a few minutes, a phone call would turn this misunderstanding into something that would challenge everything Marcus thought he knew about judging people by appearances. The tension in the corridor grew thicker as more shoppers gathered, their whispered conversations creating a low buzz that mixed with the ambient sounds of the mall. Sarah stood perfectly still, her white cane resting against her leg, her dignified silence more powerful than any argument she could have made. Jake's finger hovered over his radio, his instincts warring with his training. Something felt fundamentally wrong about the situation, but Marcus was his senior partner, and challenging him publicly could cost Jake his job. The economy had been tough, and security positions weren't easy to come by. "What's taking so long, Rivera?" Marcus demanded, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd. "Make the call." Before Jake could respond, his radio crackled to life with an incoming message. "All units, this is dispatch. We have Mr. Richard Harrison requesting immediate escort to the main lobby for his 3 o'clock appointment with Ms. Sarah Chen. Repeat, VIP escort requested for Ms. Chen's meeting with building owner Mr. Harrison." The blood drained from Marcus's face as the words echoed through his radio speaker. Around them, several shoppers who had been filming the confrontation exchanged glances, realizing they might have captured something significant. Jake stared at his partner, then at Sarah, who had gone very still at the mention of her name. "Marcus," he said quietly. "Ms. Chen." A new voice called from across the corridor. An elderly man in an expensive charcoal suit was approaching, flanked by 2 other security guards and a woman in business attire carrying a tablet. Richard Harrison moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his expression shifting from expectation to concern as he took in the scene. Sarah turned toward the familiar voice, relief flooding her features. "Mr. Harrison." "Sarah, my dear," Richard said, his voice warm but increasingly puzzled as he noticed the crowd and the positioning of the security guards. "What's going on here? Why are you standing in the corridor? I expected you'd be up in the office by now." Marcus felt his career flashing before his eyes. Richard Harrison wasn't just the building owner. He was one of the most influential developers in Portland, with connections throughout the business community. The kind of man who could end a security guard's employment with a single phone call. "Sir," Marcus began, his voice suddenly much smaller, "there's been a situation." "What kind of situation?" Richard's voice took on a sharper edge as he looked between the guards and Sarah. He noticed her slightly disheveled appearance, the way she held herself with careful dignity despite obvious distress. "Sarah, are you all right?" Sarah took a measured breath before responding. "I'm fine, Mr. Harrison. There seems to have been a misunderstanding about my presence here." Jake stepped forward, recognizing that someone needed to take control of the situation before it got worse. "Sir, I think there may have been some confusion about Ms. Chen's appointment. We weren't properly informed." "Confusion?" Richard's eyes narrowed as he looked at Marcus, whose face had gone from pale to red. "What exactly happened here?" The woman with the tablet, Richard's assistant Linda, had been quietly recording the conversation and taking notes. She whispered something to Richard, who nodded grimly. Marcus realized he had to say something, anything, to salvage the situation. "Mr. Harrison, sir, we were just doing our job. We thought. There have been issues with people coming in and—" He trailed off, realizing that every word was making things worse. "You thought what, exactly?" Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, and several people were still recording with their phones. "Please, enlighten me about what led you to detain my appointment." Sarah placed a gentle hand on Richard's arm. "Mr. Harrison, perhaps we could discuss this upstairs? I don't think a public corridor is the best place for this conversation." Her grace under pressure only made Marcus's behavior look worse by contrast. Richard noticed her diplomacy, the way she was trying to defuse a situation that could have become much more explosive. "Of course, you're absolutely right," Richard said, then turned to address the security guards with ice in his voice. "Thompson, Rivera, report to my office immediately after Ms. Chen and I conclude our meeting. Linda will provide you with the exact time." As they moved toward the elevator, Jake caught sight of his reflection in the polished elevator doors. He looked young and uncertain, nothing like the confident security professional he'd hoped to become. Marcus looked worse, sweaty, defensive, and clearly aware that his judgment call had been catastrophically wrong. The elevator ride to the third floor was silent except for the mechanical hum of the machinery. Sarah stood calmly beside Richard, while Linda checked messages on her tablet. When the doors opened, they revealed a corridor lined with photographs of Richard's various development projects around the Pacific Northwest. Richard's office occupied a corner of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of downtown Portland and the Willamette River beyond. The autumn rain had intensified, creating rivers down the glass that distorted the city lights beginning to flicker on in the growing dusk. "Please sit," Richard said, gesturing toward a comfortable leather chair across from his desk. "Can Linda get you anything? Coffee, tea, water?" "Water would be nice, thank you," Sarah replied, settling into the chair with practiced ease. She could hear the rain against the windows, the distant hum of traffic below, the quiet efficiency of Linda preparing refreshments. Richard sat across from her, his expression serious. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. What happened downstairs was completely unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for my staff's actions." Sarah considered her words carefully. She could have been angry, could have demanded immediate consequences for the guards, could have used this situation to make a point about discrimination and prejudice. Instead, she chose a different path. "Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your apology, but I think this situation might actually be an opportunity rather than just a problem." Richard raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "Your security staff made assumptions based on my disability and my appearance. They saw someone they thought didn't belong in an upscale shopping center, and they acted on those assumptions without bothering to verify the facts." Sarah paused, accepting the glass of water Linda offered. "But that kind of thinking doesn't just affect me. It affects how your business operates, how your customers are treated, and ultimately, how successful you can be in a diverse community. Richard leaned back in his chair, impressed despite the circumstances. This was exactly the kind of insight he'd hoped to gain from their meeting, though he'd never expected it to come from such a personal demonstration. "You're talking about the accessibility consulting contract," he said. "Among other things, yes." Sarah took a sip of water, organizing her thoughts. What happened today illustrates perfectly why businesses need comprehensive accessibility training, not just for legal compliance, but for customer service excellence. Your guards weren't just discriminating against me, they were potentially driving away customers and creating liability for your company. Linda looked up from her note-taking, exchanged a glance with Richard. They both knew Sarah was right, and her calm, analytical response to what could have been a traumatic experience showed exactly the kind of professional perspective they needed. "The irony," Sarah continued, "is that I came here today to discuss how to make your properties more welcoming and accessible to people with disabilities. Instead, I experienced firsthand exactly the kind of barriers I was planning to help you eliminate." Richard stood and walked to the window, looking down at the mall floor below where shoppers continued their routines, unaware of the significant conversation taking place above them. The rain was beginning to ease, and the late afternoon sun was trying to break through the clouds. "What would you recommend?" he asked, turning back to face her. Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the building. "Well, first, we need to talk about training. But more importantly, we need to discuss what really happened down there, and what it means for your business going forward." As if on cue, Linda's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at it, then at Richard. "Sir, we're getting reports that videos of the incident downstairs are starting to appear on social media. #BlindGirlThrownOut is beginning to trend locally." Richard closed his eyes briefly, realizing that this situation was about to become much bigger than just an internal personnel matter. When he opened them, Sarah was watching him with an expression of understanding rather than accusation. "Mr. Harrison," she said quietly, "this is exactly why our conversation today is so important. How you handle the situation, how your company responds to what happened, will say everything about who you are as a business leader and what your company stands for." Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light across the office. The day that had started with such promise, then descended into embarrassment and confrontation, was about to transform into something none of them had expected. The real test wasn't what had happened downstairs, it was what would happen next. The golden afternoon light streaming through Richard's office windows created long shadows across the polished conference table where Sarah and Richard had spread out architectural plans, accessibility guidelines, and tablet computers displaying social media feeds. What had begun as a routine business meeting had evolved into something much more significant. Linda entered the office carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a tablet showing the latest social media updates. "The story is gaining momentum, sir. We're up to 15,000 shares on the main video, and local news stations are starting to call for comment." Richard rubbed his temples, understanding that they were approaching a crossroads. "What are people saying?" "It's mixed," Linda replied diplomatically. "Some are calling for boycotts, others are defending the security guards, but most seem to be waiting to see how we respond." Sarah had been quiet during this exchange, listening to the rhythm of Richard's concerns and Linda's professional damage control mode. Finally, she spoke up. "Mr. Harrison, you have a choice to make. You can treat this as a public relations crisis to be managed, or you can treat it as an opportunity to demonstrate real leadership." Richard looked at her with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Most companies, when faced with a situation like this, go into defensive mode. They issue careful statements, maybe provide some sensitivity training, perhaps make a donation to a disability rights organization. It addresses the immediate problem but doesn't create lasting change. Sarah stood and moved toward the window, her hand finding the smooth surface of the glass. Below, she could hear the sounds of the mall continuing its normal operations. Conversations, footsteps, the distant music from stores. "But you have the opportunity to do something different. Something that could transform not just this incident, but how your entire company operates, and how other businesses think about accessibility and inclusion." Richard leaned forward, intrigued. "I'm listening. What if, instead of just apologizing and moving on, we use this as the launching point for a comprehensive accessibility initiative? Not just compliance training, but a fundamental shift in how your company approaches customer service and community engagement." Linda looked up from her tablet. What would that look like practically? Sarah turned back toward them, her expression animated with possibility. We start with your security staff, not punitive action, but real education. Bring in people with disabilities to share their experiences, provide hands-on training about different types of disabilities and assistive technologies, create policies that prioritize dignity and respect over assumptions. She began moving around the office as she spoke, her confidence growing with each word. Then we expand it throughout your organization. Customer service training for all staff, physical accessibility improvements beyond ADA minimums, partnerships with disability organizations, employment initiatives for people with disabilities. Richard found himself caught up in her vision. That would be a significant investment. It would be, Sarah agreed. But it would also be a significant competitive advantage. The disability community represents a trillion-dollar market segment that most businesses ignore or serve poorly. You could position your properties as leaders in accessibility and inclusion. Before Richard could respond, there was a knock at the office door. Linda opened it to reveal Marcus and Jake, both looking uncomfortable and uncertain. Marcus had changed out of his wrinkled uniform shirt into a clean one, and Jake had tried to smooth down his usually messy hair. "Sir," Marcus began hesitantly, "you asked us to report after your meeting." Richard gestured for them to come in, then looked at Sarah. "This is your choice. How would you like to handle this?" Sarah considered for a moment, then addressed the guards directly. "Marcus, Jake, please sit down. I'd like to talk with you about what happened earlier." Marcus remained standing, his defensive posture unchanged. "Look, miss, I was just doing my job. We get all kinds of people coming through here, and we have to make judgment calls about security." "I understand that," Sarah replied calmly. "But I'd like you to help me understand what exactly made you think I was a security threat." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Marcus, maybe we should." "She was acting suspicious," Marcus interrupted. "Moving around too much, drawing attention to herself, claiming to have some appointment that we weren't told about." "I see," Sarah said. "So if I understand correctly, the fact that I was asking for directions, trying to navigate an unfamiliar space, and mentioning a legitimate appointment, these were the behaviors that seemed suspicious to you?" When she put it that way, Marcus realized how weak his justification sounded. "Well, it's not just that. We see a lot of scammers, people pretending to be disabled to get sympathy or distract from shoplifting. Have you ever encountered someone actually faking blindness?" Sarah asked. Marcus hesitated. Not specifically, no. "But you assumed I was faking it because, why exactly?" The question hung in the air. Marcus couldn't articulate an answer that didn't sound prejudiced, and Jake was beginning to understand the deeper implications of their actions. Richard watched the exchange with growing respect for Sarah's approach. She wasn't attacking or humiliating the guards, she was educating them, forcing them to examine their own assumptions. "Marcus," Sarah continued, "I want to show you something." She pulled out her phone and opened an app. This is a navigation app designed for people who are blind or visually impaired. It uses GPS and audio cues to help me get around. She demonstrated the app, which began speaking directions in a clear, synthetic voice. "I also have apps that can identify currency, read text aloud, and help me identify objects using the camera. I carry a foldable white cane, and I've been trained in mobility techniques since I was a child." She paused, letting this information sink in. The point is, blindness isn't what you see in movies. We're not helpless, and we don't need to act in any particular way to prove our disability to strangers. Jake spoke up for the first time. I'm sorry, Ms. Chen. I should have trusted my instincts that something was wrong with how we were handling the situation." Sarah nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Jake. That takes courage to admit." Marcus remained silent, struggling with the realization that his years of experience had led him to make a serious error in judgment. Richard stood and moved to his desk. "Gentlemen, Ms. Chen and I have been discussing a comprehensive accessibility initiative for all of our properties. This incident has made it clear that we need to do better, not just in policy but in practice." He pulled out 2 folders and handed them to the guards. "These are enrollment forms for a professional development program. It includes disability awareness training, customer service excellence, and conflict de-escalation techniques. Completion of this program will be required for continued employment, but it will also come with a pay increase and advancement opportunities. Marcus looked up from the folder, surprised. "You're not firing us?" "That decision depends on several factors," Richard replied seriously, "including your willingness to learn from this experience and make meaningful changes in how you approach your job." Sarah added, "Marcus, I'm going to make you an offer. I'd like you to be part of the pilot program for this new training initiative. You'll work directly with me and others in the disability community to understand what went wrong today and how to prevent it from happening again." "Why would you want to work with me after what I did?" Marcus asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Because you have 15 years of security experience, and if we can help you understand how to better serve customers with disabilities, you can teach other guards. Real change happens when people who made mistakes become advocates for doing better." Linda's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, then at Richard. "Sir, Channel 8 News is here. They want a statement about the incident." Richard looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "Mr. Harrison, this is your moment to show what kind of leader you are." "Will you come with me?" he asked. "I think that would send exactly the right message," she replied. As they prepared to leave the office, Marcus stepped forward. "Ms. Chen, I want to apologize. Not because my boss is here, but because I was wrong. I made assumptions about you based on ignorance, and that's not who I want to be." Sarah extended her hand, which Marcus shook gratefully. "Apology accepted, Marcus. Now let's work together to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The small group made their way toward the elevators, passing the same corridor where the confrontation had occurred just hours earlier. The afternoon crowd had thinned, and the dramatic tension of earlier had been replaced by the normal rhythm of retail life. As they waited for the elevator, Sarah reflected on how dramatically the day had changed. She'd arrived expecting a routine business consultation and instead had experienced discrimination, public humiliation, and ultimately, the opportunity to create meaningful change. The elevator doors opened, and as they descended toward the main level where reporters were waiting, Sarah realized that sometimes the most powerful transformations come from the most difficult moments. The key was having the courage to turn conflict into conversation, assumptions into understanding, and mistakes into opportunities for growth. The rain had stopped completely now, and through the mall's glass facade, they could see the sun setting over Portland, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. It had been a day of storms, both literal and metaphorical, but it was ending with the promise of clearer skies ahead. As the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened to reveal waiting cameras and microphones, Sarah took a deep breath. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time all day, she felt genuinely optimistic about what they could accomplish together. The story that had started with security guards throwing out a blind girl was about to become something much more powerful. A story about second chances, personal growth, and the transformation that's possible when people choose understanding over judgment and action over apology.